Hi, I'm Nick. My pronouns are they, them. I'll start my paper now. In recent years, the ways in which sexual violence is weaponized have grown increasingly apparent. From the racialized demonization of Muslim men associated with so-called grooming gangs, to self-described gender-critical feminists pursuing transphobic agendas through associating sexual violence with trans women. This paper presents a challenge to such weaponization by employing theories of embodiment to understand defendants charged with sexual violence within the criminal punishment system. I suggest that doing so can provide insight as to how these defendants are pathologized and scapegoated, obfuscating the widespread problem of sexual violence, and in doing so, fueling and justifying the need for an ever-expanding white supremacist, ableist, and classist criminal punishment system. In terms of structure, I start by outlining the discursive material embodied framework that I'm employing. Next, I show how this framing makes three key contributions that can deepen understandings of defendants. First, I demonstrate how an embodied framework underscores how defendants are shaped by and shape the criminal punishment system in which they are embedded. Second, I demonstrate how an embodied approach necessitates a focus on intersections of oppression. Third, I show how this framework can challenge biological essentialism that is entrenched in the ways we understand sexual violence. I conclude by suggesting how this framework is important in how defendants charged with sexual violence are understood and in the abolitionist project of undoing the criminal punishment system. From within the extensive literature on embodiment, the framework that I'm employing understands embodiment as material discursive practice. By this, I mean bodies shape and bodies are shaped by discursive practices that are not fully constrained by them. Importantly, discursive practices are not merely linguistic or theoretical. Foucault explicates the ways in which the physical body is brought into the frame of analysis to, and I quote, show how the deployments of power are directly connected to the body, to bodies, functions, physiological processes, sensations, and pleasures. Far from the body being effaced, what is needed is to make it visible through an analysis in which the biological and the historical are not consecutive to one another, but are bound together in an increasingly complex fashion in accordance with the modern technologies of power that take life as their objective. However, as Karen Barad notes, Foucault inadequately demonstrates how materiality plays an active role in the workings of power. She proposes an embodied performativity drawing on chemist Niels Bohr's epistemological framing of concepts, or actual physical arrangements, as producing meaning through material interactions. Barad states that matter refers to the materiality or materialization of phenomena, not to an inherent fixed property of abstract, independently existing objects of Newtonian physics. She contends that this conceptualization calls into question dualisms such as object-subject, knower-known, nature-culture, and word-world. As such, bodies, amongst other phenomena, are constituted through the discursive remaking of boundaries, both in relation to other bodies and the material world more broadly. This material discursive framework of embodiment that I'm proposing also draws on Sarah Ahmed's work on affect and how the surfaces of bodies can be understood as sticky. This very physical descriptor contributes to an understanding of how materials interact with one another, how discursive practices circulate unevenly with power differentials affecting the ways in which, in Ahmed's words, emotions circulate between people, how they make and shape bodies. The impact of the material is emphasized, whereby emotion or atmosphere is located somewhere, centering the experience and role of bodies. Sarah Ahmed notes how boundaries and surfaces are made through what she terms intensifications. She says, it is through the intensification of pain that bodies and worlds materialize and take shape, or that the effects of boundary, surface, and fixity are produced. So this material discursive framework that I've briefly outlined locates defendants within a system of practices that make and remake boundaries to define matter. This brings into the frame of analysis a consideration of the relationship or relationships between individual defendants and the criminal punishment system in which they are located. Examining the production of the human-non-human boundary can shed light on how defendants are produced through the criminal punishment system. Gaspard examines how the boundary between human and non-human is drawn and redrawn with respect to critical disability studies, notably deciphering who is deemed human and to what extent has significant eugenicist overtones. This encourages a close examination of the ways in which defendants are variously subsumed within criminal punishment processes and distinguished as discrete bodies, and where or if they are treated as human. Poir notes how this is also necessarily a site where a persistent entwinement of race and animality cannot be elided. The positioning of the defendant also has a temporal aspect. Hortense Spillers writes how the material context constitutes, I quote, for its American and indigenous peoples, a scene of actual mutilation, dismemberment, and exile. The context and history within which bodies are situated impacts upon how they are shaped. This is of great importance in considering how defendants are located within the violent histories of the criminal punishment system, rather than in a moment of isolation. And bodies are not only shaped by material practice, but they also shape material practices through agency. Continued production and reproduction of boundaries retain space for the possibility of change. Robert McGruer articulates how disabled bodies offer material challenges to compulsory able-bodiedness. He argues that from such bodies is an insistence that such a system is never as good as it gets, and about imagining bodies and desires otherwise. And it's through this complex understanding of how bodies relate to the structures within which they are placed that we can develop an understanding of how defendants are positioned and within the criminal punishment system, both being produced by it and contributing to its reproduction while simultaneously offering resistance. The second important contribution of an embodied approach is that it necessitates an intersectional analysis. Bringing the ways in which bodies are discursively shaped into the frame of analysis can demonstrate the complex interplays through which bodies are constituted by markers of race, ability, class, as well as by sex that is the focal point, typically when examining sexual violence. The ways in which gender and race intersect in the body have been explored and narrated by Black feminists, such as Bell Hooks and Kimberly Crenshaw. Bodies are always racialized simultaneously to being gendered. Hortense Spillers writes about how gender difference was inscribed onto the bodies of slaves, having been violently and willfully stolen. Here, the female body and the male body become a territory of cultural and political maneuver, not at all gender-related. The fetishization of Black women is ongoing, and one manifestation being adultification, whereby Black girls are seen to be older than they are and inscribed with sexuality. As Travis Alabanza has written, Black bodies continue to be degendered, hypergendered, and misgendered. Bodies are further always ascribed with varying levels of ability and sexuality. McGruer writes, compulsory heterosexuality is intertwined with compulsory able-bodiedness. Both systems work to reproduce the able body and heterosexuality. Ability and disability are unevenly distributed according to racial capitalism. Gaspard Poir writes about how some bodies may reclaim identities of disability and others are debilitated and discarded. One site of disposal is surely the prison and the criminal punishment system more broadly. He notes that what constitutes the able body is ever evolving and its apparent reference are ever shrinking. Considering how defendants are embodied brings to the fore a consideration of such intersecting identity markers. The third contribution of employing embodiment theory involves an interruption of biological essentialist assumptions about defendants charged with sexual violence and how we understand sexual violence itself. The biological essentialist assumptions that I'm referring to here are the colonial practice of cisgender heteronormativity that entails mapping a male-female binary onto sexual organs, labeling as male anyone with a penis and female anybody that has a vagina. It is clear how this immediately erases gender variance, gender nonconformity, and the sexual violence and mutilation enacted on intersex people at birth. Biologically reductionist accounts of gender are both embedded within and reproductive of colonialism through which a gender binary was and continues to be violently imposed. Interrupting biological essentialism through the implementation of an embodied framework is of importance because biologically essentialist conceptions of gender project understandings of sexual violence onto bodies in ways that are violently productive of transmisogyny. As described by Julia Serrano, transmisogyny can be defined as hatred of trans women. It's largely based on a fear that trans women have, or used to have, a penis and are consequently inherently dangerous to cisgender women. Trans women and trans feminine people are equated with rape culture, despite the higher rates of sexual violence and homicide enacted against trans women, and particularly Black trans women. As Alex Sharp has illustrated, biological essentialism also harms transmasculine people and trans men, a large number of whom have been convicted of assault by penetration on the basis of deception that they tricked a partner about their real gender. If, as I have suggested above, centering embodiment focuses on the ways in which bodies shape and are shaped by processes and systems, then such an approach must challenge the rigidity of biological essentialism and the violence of the criminal punishment system that plays a part in imposing it. Further, in considering the multiple intersections through which bodies are produced, it becomes clear that it is impossible to categorize bodies into two types. Centering embodiment in understanding sexual violence directly challenges this essentialism in drawing attention to the complexity and diversity of bodies, undermining binary framings that uphold and entrench violent transphobia and transmisogyny in the criminal punishment system and beyond. So in this paper, I hope to have demonstrated the contributions that can be made to understanding defendants charged with sexual violence through an embodied framework. In positioning defendants as moving parts that shape and are shaped by the white supremacist criminal punishment system, we can better understand the ways in which prosecutions are racialized, with greater danger and risk sticking to Black men and men of color. We can better understand how transphobia is enacted, where bodies do not comply to rigid cisgender norms produced through the criminal punishment system, with prison sentences for transmasculine people for consensual sex, and scaremongering about trans women, leading to immense violence and death on the men's prison estate. The criminal punishment system has not only failed to protect marginalized genders from sexual violence, but has in fact made the harm worse. And in doing so, I hope, open space for a deeper consideration of what justice may look like when we think of sexual violence outside of the police, the courts, and prisons. Thanks for watching my presentation.